In this video, we're going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. Now, you all know how to factor. We've been factoring for a while. We've spent 2.5 weeks on that. So we need to think about all the steps we took to factor. But this, we're going to take it one more step further. Once you factor, we're going to actually solve that quadratic equation by looking for the zeros of the function. And we've talked about this with our graphs. The solution to a quadratic equation is where the graph crosses or touches the x-axis. So we're looking for the x-intercepts. When you're looking for x-intercepts, y is going to be 0. So instead of this expression, which this is already in factored form, but instead of this being equal to y, since we're trying to solve the equation, we make y 0 because we're looking for the x-intercepts. Now we're going to find that using the zero product property. Now the zero product property is very simple. If you multiply by 0, you're going to get 0. If a times b is 0, then a has to be 0 or b has to be, they could both be 0. But at least one of those values has to be 0 for your product to be 0. So if you have this binomial times this binomial equal to 0, that means one of your binomials, whether it's the x plus 3 or the x plus 2, one of those binomials has to be 0. That's the only way you can multiply and get 0. That's the only way you can get the x-intercept is if you know what the x value is that makes y 0. That's what we're looking for. What x would go here so that I would get 0 in this binomial, then multiply by whatever this is, because it doesn't really matter, because when you multiply by 0, you get 0. So it's really simple. You just set each binomial equal to 0. So you set x plus 3 equal to 0, and you set x plus 2 equal to 0. It's very, very simple. So let's look at this first problem.
In this problem, you will use the zero product property. What are the solutions of the equation the quantity 4 times t plus 1 times the quantity t minus 2 equals 0? Start by writing the original equation. Use the zero product property. By this property, 4 times t plus 1 equals 0, or t minus 2 equals 0. Solve each equation for t. Subtract 1 from each side of the first equation, and add 2 to each side of the second equation.
So all they did was solve these equations, which this one's not finished, but you're just setting each binomial equal to 0 and solving.
Use the inverse operations if needed. Divide each side of the first equation by 4. Since the second equation is already simplified, you don't have to use any inverse operations.
Just solve for t.
How else can you write the solutions? You can write the solutions as a set in roster form, -1/4, 2.
Notice this is not a parenthesis, because if it were a parenthesis, this would look like a point, x comma y. These are brackets. This is roster form, where you would list all the possible solutions, and in this case we have 2 of them. That means your graph of this equation, if you were to draw your parabola, would cross the x-axis 2 times, and it crosses the x-axis at -1/4 and 2.
Now it's your turn.
All right, so I want you to use the zero product property on this. Pause the video and take a couple of minutes. This will not take very long, and find the solutions of this equation. Now, your correct answer to this is -1, 5. You just set each binomial equal to 0 and solve. It's very simple.
In this problem, you will solve an equation by factoring. What are the solutions of the equation x squared plus 8 times x plus 15 equals 0? Your choices are A, -5 and -3, B, -5 and 3, C, -3 and 5, and D, 3 and 5.
Now notice the big difference in this one and the last problem is that this one's not factored yet. The last problem was already broken into the two binomials. We have to actually factor this first before we can ever start solving our equation.
Start with the original equation. Factor the polynomial. How can you factor the polynomial x squared plus 8 times x plus 15? Find two integers with the product of 15 and a sum of 8.
What can you multiply to get 15, add to get 8? Which two numbers? That's not your answer. Even if you find it up there, that's not the answer. That's just in the process of factoring. We have not solved this equation yet.
Two integers with the product of 15 and a sum of 8 are 3 and 5.
3 times 5 is 15. 3 plus 5 is 8. Simple factoring there. Those are the easy ones.
Now use the zero product property to change each binomial into an equation. Subtract to isolate x in each equation. Subtract 3 from each side of the first equation, and subtract 5 from each side of the second equation. Now solve for x in each equation. The solutions are -3 and -5. The correct answer is A.
All right, so be very careful. 3 and 5 were the numbers you needed at the beginning to factor, but they are not the solution because you have to set each binomial equal to 0 and solve for x. So be very careful with that.
Now it's your turn.
All right, factor this trinomial. So go back to what we did. We spent 2 weeks on factor this trinomial and then solve it and find the solutions of that equation. Okay, your correct answer is -2, 7. Now you had to use 2 and -7 in your binomials. They skipped that step here where you would have the two binomials equal to 0. But your two binomials should be m plus 2 and m minus 7. And then you solve each one of those for m, and you get -2 and -7, or +7, excuse me. So those are your solutions. All right, we're going to look at one more example, and this one is writing in standard form first. This is one of your vocabulary terms. Standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals either 0 or y or f of x, however you're dealing with the quadratic equation. So the first thing we have to do here is analyze, is this in standard form? And the answer is no. Our c is on the wrong side. So all we have to do is just move our 18. So think about this. Why do you need to move, or why do you need to subtract 18 from each side before you factor? And it's simply stated here, you have to have 0 on one side of your equation to use the zero product property. So if I subtract 18, I get a 0. So this is in standard form, 4x squared minus 21x minus 18 equals 0. And then solve this by factoring. Now these are the more difficult ones where you have to multiply 4 and 18. They did not go through that whole process here, but you multiply 4 times -18, find the factors of that. That will equal -21, where you have to rewrite your trinomial and group it. So this one's going to take several steps in between the trinomial and these two binomials. So they've given you the answer here. And so now you take and use the zero product property, set 4x plus 3 equal to 0, and set x minus 6 equal to 0, and solve for x. So your solutions are -3/4 and 6. You've got to remember how we factored these trinomials when a was greater than 1. This is where you multiply A and C, find the factors that add to give you B, rewrite, and factor by grouping. There were several steps. Now we take that one step further and use our zero product property to actually find the solutions. This is where the graph crosses the x-axis in this quadratic equation. All right, so now it's your turn. Take this equation, first put it into standard form, then factor it. Now the nice thing about this one is your a in front of the x squared is a 1, so this one's not difficult like the last example. This one's actually the easy ones. So solve this equation. All right, your correct answer is -7, and the reason why it's only -7 is once you factor this, you should have gotten a 7 times 7, which is 49, and 7 plus 7 is 14. So both binomials are the same. They're both x plus 7. So if you set them both equal to 0, you get the same answer of -7. What this means is that when you draw your parabola, it doesn't actually cross the x-axis. It just sits on the x-axis at -7. So it only touches the graph in one spot. Be sure to bring your answers to your questions and your notes to class so that we can look at some more examples in class and review factoring together.